for joining us all today. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 2 of Inside the Rookery, where we are coming to you live from the Cymera Festival at the Pleasance in Edinburgh. I'm joined today by Rebecca Zahabi, Oliver K Langmead, Andy Law, and myself, Lindsay Law. I am your host, and we're here today to talk about when writing worlds collide. So I will ask Rebecca and each of you to introduce yourselves, and then we'll get into the questions, which have been, as always, pre-submitted on Discord by our Discord server users and patrons, and we'll also take questions from the audience.
Hi everyone, I'm a French, Iranian, British writer, mostly a novelist, but I did some game writing. I do that as another job, do some choose-your-own-adventure game writing as well. I've got a novel out, it's just come out in May, called The Collarbound. So lots of big fantasy world building happening there, so I'd be excited to talk about that more. And aside from that, I dabble in a bit of everything, did a bit of playwriting, did a bit of rewriting Icelandic sagas for fun, things like that, so I'm ready for anything.
Hi, I'm Oliver K Langmead, also Oliver Langmead, please call me Ollie. I have a bunch of novels published across science fiction and fantasy, and a lot of them have come from RPGs I've run. I do teach a little bit of games writing and branching narratives writing as well, at various places.
And I'm Andy Law, as anyone that watches Inside the Rookery will already know. I've been in the RPG industry for the last long time now. I originally started on Warhammer and moved through a whole host of other games in the interim. I write, I edit, I do maps, I do illustrations, I do pretty much everything. I wear many hats. I'm most recently known for writing the most recent edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and doing the maps for Critical Role.
And I am Lindsay Law, long-time gaming partner of Andy's and more recently writing partner on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition and now in Inside the Rookery. So we shall get on with our questions. I'll go through some of the pre-submitted ones first while you think of yours in the audience. But if you have any, at any time you want to jump in, just shove up your hand and I will come to you. So first up, we have one for the ever-reliable Kilishandra, who always asks a good question. And she asks, how do you stop world building interfering with plot in your writing medium of choice? Stories, scripts, RPGs, etc.
I don't tend to start from a place of world building, which I know is a dreadful thing to say in an RPG-based session. I tend to start from a very fixed point and then let everything work out from there. Like in my last book, Glitterati, I began with a really, really awful protagonist. He's a horrible, horrible man. And then the whole world span out from him, what made him so horrible. So starting from a small point and going outwards helps there. And finding the limits is the limits of the book. It's different for an RPG because players will do whatever the hell they want. And they test the limits in very different ways than I think in a novel.
I think you're right. I often start out and have characters, I have some plot points and have some world building, often all in different folders.
Live audience,
Thank you for
interactive dogs.
And so sometimes I bring all of those together, so I might have a world and a bit of a plot, and I think, oh, actually these mesh really well, and I bring them into the same document. I find a good way of doing it for role-play games and for novels is give as much of the world as you need for your story. So you put the players in the world, you give them a bit they need to start playing. As soon as they start playing, and basically it's like a camera, as soon as the camera turns, suddenly you're describing what they're looking at. And I find with novel writing it's the same. I just let my characters go places. And if they go somewhere where I need to do some world building, it's like building in front of the person walking. You quickly build as they go in that direction and sort of build around them. So that way, hopefully, the world building doesn't get in the way of the story.
Procedurally generated.
Well, I'm not an AI, but
I'm coming obviously from a very different angle because I'm coming from the roleplay side, and roleplay writing is very different to, for example, telling a story, where the characters are often central. The adventure as it spins around those characters are essential, where in a roleplay, it's all about inspiring someone else to tell their stories. Particularly if you're dealing with, say, a core book, the initial book that gets you started in the roleplay. the story is often secondary to the setting to inspire the GM as they may present that to their players. And when it comes to, say, an adventure, equivalent of a story on the role-playing side, again, you've got to be careful you don't provide too much detail, because every GM is going to approach this adventure in their own way. Every GM is going to find some little nugget that makes them go, yeah, this is my adventure. That's the bits that, as a role-playing writer, you very much want to focus on. The bits that make excitement, make everybody go, I want to play this, make the GM suddenly go, this is awesome. So it's quite a different style of writing in general, I would say, because you're very much giving someone else the story rather than telling the story yourself. You're providing inspiration, so to speak.
It's interesting to think about the difference between, when we've play-tested our adventures and role-playing compared to maybe when your novels have been read by people for the first time, and how much input we might take in playtesting and you might take in novel writing.
I mean, I don't know about writers, but I've got a critique group, and every week we sort of, criticize each other's work, have a look at it. So there's very much quite a lot of feedback. It's not that I write a novel in an ivory tower and then just sort of send it off as it is. A lot of the world building happens through discussions, people challenging stuff, or even just people thinking, how would that actually work? How can I cheat this? A bit like players. Is there a way to use this that's more interesting? Is there a way to use the money, the currency, the magic in an interesting way? And I think just the story kind of builds from that as well. Of course, it's different once it's written and it goes out into the world, then readers immediately find the one thing you hadn't thought of, don't they? But then players do that as a GM as well. So
I've done that with a couple of books. I've run a one-shot set in the world of the book, just to let players bounce off it. So they discover some weird stuff. For instance, my first book, Dark Star, is set on a world without nothing casts. The sun doesn't cast visible light in a visible spectrum, and light is very rare. And my players bouncing off that world, we discovered that guns didn't have muzzle flashes because the local metals don't work that properly, and that ended up in the book.
Nice.
Yeah,
love that.
Yeah.
Good detail. Yeah.
Neat little details like that, honestly. If you're writing a novel, run a one-shot, let your players bounce off it, see what they find out. It's surprisingly useful.
Somewhat similarly, on the playtest side, playtesting in the role-play environment that I have found, and I've been playtesting or running playtests for quite a long time, many publishers don't actually playtest that much. They do a bit, but they think they've got a good handle of what their setting requires and what their story requires, or because the role-play industry is not that big, they just don't have the time. They don't have the resources to run it through the entire playtest loop, meaning that doing a big playtest like we did recently on, say, Ship of Fools, it's a thing we've got coming, that was brilliant. We had like 60 groups, all of which were coming in with all manner of different feedback, and it completely changed our adventure. Completely, from the beginning right through to the very end. Because ours was system agnostic, it meant that our Ship of Fools, for some people, was a train of fools. For some people, was a spaceship of fools. For some people, was a completely different thing of fools, land ships, that was a thing. And ensuring that the text supported all of that, as well as the core story elements that we wanted to try and weave in, was something we always knew we were going to do, but reinforcing that through the text, it turned out to be really important. So yeah, playtests, awesome. We do enjoy those.
Our next one's from Seagoat, who asks, what do you prefer to write? Short stories, epic multi-book works, a series of short stories that fit together into a larger story arc, or something else?
Wow.
It depends.
Yeah.
It depends on the story. I often don't really know if it's going to be a novel or a short story, or I start writing it. I think, oh, this short story is a bit long. It's only 20,000 words. I think maybe it's a novella. And you write a bit more, you think, maybe it's not a novella, maybe it's something else. The trilogy, The Collar Bound, I didn't plan for it to be a trilogy. I just wrote and wrote and wrote. And I wasn't at the end of the story yet, and then quite a lot of words. And a friend summarized my problem beautifully. She said, I have all these words, and it's not a novel yet. I was like, yes, I have one of those. Yeah, and sometimes you write this. I wrote some flash fiction, and to my great surprise, I wrote it, stopped, and I was like, oh, the story's finished. 500 words. That had never happened to me before, but I just got to the end of what I had to say. So Sorry, that's a very unuseful answer.
Not at all. It's supposed to be your answer, and it is, so that's perfect.
It just so happens.
Yeah.
Do you plan? Do you know you're writing a novel?
I try and write short stories. They never end up as short stories. Glitterati, the newest one, that started off as a short story. Now it's a book. No, I tend to.
A common illness then.
Yeah, it just keeps going. No, I do tend to write. I've written more novels and books than I have short stories by a long shot. I think there's something about the form I find very interesting. But either way, I still try and do something very different each time with each book. Try and challenge myself with each of them. But yeah, I'm very much a novel writer.
I suppose on the role-playing side, the equivalent is short adventures, one-shots, moving off towards your epic sweeping campaigns. When you're producing them, so you're commissioning other people to do these things, it's very much this will be approximately a 7K adventure, short one-shot. It's going to be a 15,000 word adventure. Okay, so this is going to last for a few sessions. It's going to be a 25,000 word adventure. This one's going to last for potentially quite a while, depending upon how you pitch it, depending upon how the GMs individually pick that up, or Dungeon Masters or whatever. So from the pitching side, you tend to find it's actually quite fixed, and the writers are expected to fit within the formats that they've been given. So it's usually, not always, it's usually not in the writer's hand in the RPG market. So you tend to find working for hire in an RPG, you very much have to fit within certain pre-established boxes before you go. If you're writing for yourself, self-publishing, being a company like we are, just randomly adding bits and pieces, you don't have those necessary limits in place. And they are necessary sometimes, because your short stories can turn into epic adventures if you're not careful. And indeed, our Ship of Fools, because as we said, massive playtest for that one, that turned into, well, originally it was going to be a 7K adventure. It's now, what, 50K? 60,
and
something like that.
Mark Gibbons
And then
do all the art.
Mark's doing all the art, and Mark, he's one of Blizzard's ex-artists. Mark is not holding back. It's extraordinary the work he's doing for that, which in turn just makes it yawn. So limitations are sometimes useful. In terms of what I prefer, I've always loved an epic campaign. I just love them. Doing the Enemy Within very recently for Warhammer was, for me, a joy.
I find you find yourself a bit bereft when you've been with characters for such a long time. With a short story, you can put it down and think, oh, I've done this. But with like a trilogy or a very long novel, you think, oh no, now I have to leave them and do something else.
I saw an interesting thread on Twitter the other day, and it was about a group of writers who wrote RPGs professionally, but also all played together. And they found that they didn't have really, not the stamina, but you know how it is, like life gets in the way. So you do maybe like 10 sessions and then you move on to something else. But they found themselves like recycling characters and ideas. And so by mistake, they just started to kind of by consensus have their own multiverse, and these characters would come back in different ways. And I thought it was interesting because, Andy, you've done that in our worlds. People that we role played years and years ago in Vampire Chronicles kind of sneak back into Warhammer in different ways. So I was quite excited to see that other people do it, and we're not the only ones with a multiverse.
It's quite a common thing.
I mean, there's Mark too, but like whatever. So next up is from Andy Leask. Andy was supposed to be with us tonight on the panel, but he is really unwell. But he sent us a question in his stead.
Thanks, Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Andy.
Great help.
So how do you decide how much world building to share up front with the reader and how much to drip feed through the novel, adventure, story that you're telling?
I mean, in my case, I like to drip feed it. I think it's personal preference in this case. I like to read stories in which I don't really know what's happening. I have a bit of work as a reader to do. I have to run to catch up a bit. I get thrown words and I try and guess what it is, and then I get given a bit more and a bit more. And the column round very much works like that. You start off, you get a few, someone's wearing Kerr horn around their arm. Oh yeah, of course, yeah, they're wearing Kerr horn around their arm. Of course you would be if you were working with mages. And as that develops, you think, oh yeah, you see the Kerrs, you see the horns. You're like, okay, so I've seen this before. And then you work out that it, cancels out magic. So that's why if you're working with mages, you'd be wearing it, and on like this. I just find it fun to write as a puzzle, because I think it avoids the info dump and it kind of hooks the reader with the question or a mystery. and then you bring them a bit further, and you can give them a lot more if you're not drowning them, if you're feeding them just by bits and pieces. But again, that might just be taste. I think it's just kind of what I like to read as well.
Is it as much as necessary? Feels like a fair sort of rule of thumb, because you don't want to drown your reader in lore. But then again, you know, Terry Pratchett's books wouldn't be Terry Pratchett's books if they didn't open every time by describing the fact that it's on a turtle on top of 4 elephants. It's an important detail. That
you need to know that from the start, don't you?
You do. That's the flavour. You know, would I call it a necessary detail? Probably not in some of those books, but you know.
Maybe necessary for tone. I remember one where he says, I think God was out to make a pizza and got a bit, got a bit enthusiastic about the whole business and it ended up as
increasingly creative ways to describe a flat world on top of 4 elephants on top of a turtle.
It's kind of like Once Upon a Time, isn't it? It sets the tone. Like when you hear Once Upon a Time, you know you're hearing like an Anglo-Saxon fairy tale. When you hear Flat World, you know you're
Giant pizza world, you know, off the project.
You know the tone that's coming. You know the kind of story that you're going to get.
Yeah, it is very easy, I find, especially for authors who are very early on getting to grips with their work and how to write a book. There's an impulse to put everything in there.
Yeah.
And you know, there's something to be recommended for on your first draft. Just go for it. Just put everything in there. It's for you. It's your first draft, and then cutting back from there is a nice way of thinking about it.
I think sometimes you need to write it to know.
Yeah.
As long as you haven't written it, you're not sure, and then once you've written it, you can cut it back.
Exactly right. A first draft is often you exploring that world for yourself. You know, and then working out what the reader actually needs. The reader actually needs. Great screener.
I approve.
Yeah.
Is there any questions from the audience?
Yeah, so as you said, you sometimes rewrote Icelandic sagas for fun, and obviously you did Warhammer. What are the kind of constraints of writing in such a well-established and already set up world?
Okay, to make sure that was heard, because I'm not sure how well that came through, that's what sort of constraints are in place when you're writing within an established setting, world, or genre? And the answer is a lot to not a lot, depending on the setting at hand and depending on how much control there is in place. Before I give my answer, though, I shall move over to Icelandic answers.
Well, I actually really enjoyed reading Icelandic sagas. I started with the stories of the gods, and then I moved on to some of the stories of the humans and the human sagas, sort of the whole Icelandic books. And they're fantastic for world building, for example, because they assume lots of things that we don't. I remember a really brilliant scene in which someone has just died, and the Vikings died, and they've set him out and all that. And he wakes up in the middle of the night as a zombie. Everyone's like, oh no. So they lock him in, go and fetch his wife. They say, sorry, hubby's come back as a zombie. Can you deal with him, please? Because we don't really want him to be doing this. So she goes and sees him and she says, no, you have to stay dead now, love. And he says, yes, but there's some bones buried behind the house. Please sort that out and then I'll stay dead. She says, yeah, sure. Goes and digs out the bones and needs to be dug out. And then he goes back to being dead. And that's just given to us like that. In Edel the Red, there's a brilliant scene where they all get so drunk because they're having this big banquet, and he throws up on the table. And everyone just sort of says, it's really considered bad manners. You're supposed to go out and just vomit at the entrance. Like, are you? Is that good manners? So writing in constraints like that can be really fun, because if you've read enough, you get a bit of a feel and an idea of what you can do and what you can play with. And you get a bit of an idea. I guess it's a bit like getting a writing pitch. Someone's given you something to write around, a hook. You know that there are some things you can't do, but because of the constraints, it can be quite fun to explore the space you've got available there. I'm sure it's the same for Warhammer.
Absolutely. I'll go slightly further. I'll use Warhammer since that was the question you asked specifically. There's multiple Warhammers, which actually makes it a little bit more easy to play with than you might first imagine. Games Workshop has a very tight control over the Warhammer world and their intellectual property, and rightly so. But there's a significant difference, say, for example, between the Warhammer of the very first edition of the role-playing game and then the second edition of the role-playing game. Okay, one was filled with all manner of in-jokes and puns and satire. The next one was very much a more grimmer take of what the Warhammer world might be, because the Warhammer world itself has changed over time. Now, as a writer, you come in and you're generally told it needs to be pitched around one version of the Warhammer world or another. In the most recent edition, the 4th edition, we were given a pretty much free rein. we could choose what we wanted. So what we did was, instead of focusing on one version, we looked at the whole spread and said, how can we make something that fans of Warhammer, regardless of where they've come from, can say, that's my Warhammer. So we will have the grim and the perilous and the dark and the nasty, but sitting beside that, you'll have a priest of more, Wilhelm Abdol, saying, come the midnight hour, we all chant more, more, more. Ridiculous, silliness, which of course I wrote because I can't help myself, and I love my puns and my parodies and all the rest of those cultural references. But they sit side by side happily. So Warhammer is, in particular in this instance, far freer, but equally far tighter, because it has a very clear set of established tools. And sitting within those can be hard for a new writer. And that's where someone like myself, for example, where I was the producer for the game, I would sit down with the writer and say, these are loosely the guidelines that we have, but we are very interested in what you bring to it. So yeah.
I think the watchword here is research. Whenever you're getting into something that's been established, whether it's an IP, whether it's a lore, whether it's even a genre, it's worth doing all the reading before you get in there and get to grips with it. It's being comfortable in that setting and being able to play with it. It's just a matter of knowledge and stocking up on that knowledge.
Yeah, could not agree more. Do your homework. In fact, Lindsay was mentioning something about this earlier, so I'll actually pass over to her, because I think she's got a very good point.
I know what you're talking about.
Yes,
so on Warhammer, when we were writing for Warhammer, I mean, we'd been playing in that world for literally decades. So there was obviously all the research had been done. We had lived through it. We'd lived through multiple versions of that world. So often when I was writing, because I knew what the tone that Andy had established for that edition, but then I was just writing things that had happened and memories of people and memories of places, and just like writing about one of my characters' hometowns. And it was a really unique and like quite a privileged experience. I don't think we'll ever get that again on any other, property that we write for, but it was super fun.
It was different because it was
funny.
You were writing about things that had happened. You were writing from your memory. You were writing about, say, for example, you go to a big city, Altdorf in Warhammer World. You go to Altdorf, and you're not just writing about this new crazy place that you've researched. You're trying to think of new areas that might be there, and you don't want to contradict the established lore because, oh no, well, exactly where do I start? No worries there. You're just like, oh well, that's there, that's around the corner there because we've walked that road so many times.
Instead, I was like, I'm going to write about that fountain because that's where my honour guard were sick that time we went out of the town before I got married to that fiend, Heinrich Todbringer.
Good time.
It was fun. Good times. Have you written in other IPs? You have done role-playing writing, haven't you? So you've had that experience.
Yeah, but mostly I wasn't. We were doing this. I was writing for friends scenarios. They'd established the world. They'd established the world building, and I just wrote a few scenarios and translated and GM'd for them, actually. The first convention we did was in Edinburgh, which was fun. And I was the only English speaker. They were all French, and they were like, you can just GM and translate everything, right? That's ridiculous. But I was 18 and I said, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was very good fun. Obviously, working with French notes and speaking live English, has had some moments. Had some moments where I was like, raven, crows, corbeau, corneille. It'll be a blackbird of some definition. We'll see what happens. Yeah, that was interesting. But again, because there was quite a bit of flexibility, because I could just go and talk to them, ask them, I'd like to introduce this idea, this sounds really fun. It wasn't the same constraints as working within an IP, so...
Any other questions from the audience? I've got plenty more here, and there's some coming in line as well.
How do you find small details in the story that lead to much bigger impact, I guess?
It feels like part of the process, right? It's what details while you're writing are the ones that stand out, and how do you... Sorry, the question was, how do you find the small details in your story that sort of expand outwards and become bigger things? So when you're writing a lengthier piece, be it a novel, a book, a trilogy, even as far as that, I think you tend to, it's a process of discovery as much as it is a process of knowing sort of where you're going. For me, at least, it's a process of knowing where you're starting, knowing where you're going to end, and discovering how you get there along the way. And the small details in there that really stand out often take you by surprise. Honestly, it's not something that that's easy to plan for, and a lot of the details that become important you can make more of a deal of on the second draft, because it is a drafting process, once you've gone all the way through and come back. Give a meandering answer.
I think accurate.
It's a bit of a what if, isn't it? So you're
Yeah.
sort of exploring the story and you've got a cool concept, you think this is really cool. And then you think, so for example, for the curse, when I decided that their horns would be anti-magic and the humans were using their horns to avoid doing magic, and then you sort of think of the nitty-gritty detail, you think, I wonder what they're using as money. Are they just using coins? You're like, if everyone can do mind magic, they can very easily pretend it's one coin and
mind
change it
magic.
to something else and screw around with it. No, but wait, I've got a material that's immune to magic. Perfect, we'll just make coins out of that. That would be nice. And so sometimes by things you already have there, if you look at them in depth and you think, how would it actually work in my everyday life? It's like, say I want to buy a coffee in my world, or the equivalent of a coffee. What am I buying? How am I getting that? Where am I sleeping? Who am I paying rent to? Just really everyday life details. And just by going, how am I doing this? What would happen if? Then those little details sort of come into the story.
I always have a big bugbear in RPGs where they don't detail anything about children. So you don't know where they went to school, you don't know if there's a school system, the creatures in the forest who appear to be intelligent, they must have children, they must have a family. How are they actually perceived to be the bad guys so much? Wouldn't there be people who might want to convert them, etc., etc.? So yeah, those little details I think often in RPGs people forget about, because so many companies who own the IPs are like, you can't have children, you can't harm children, you can't do this, you can't. And absolutely, I'm not advocating for child murder, but I have advocated on many times for an actual, a reasonable society that explains those things.
I find when I play D&D, what I always find really weird is that some people get so overpowered that normal humans wouldn't stand a chance. So what's it like if you're the baker? You know what I mean? And all these adventurers are coming into your home and they can do things, they can do incredible things. So just thinking about what life would be like for everyday people, as you say, for children. I'm assuming you're not born level 20. Are you born level 20 if your two parents are level 20? Does it get inherited? In which case you've got a social class problem,
Something to investigate.
You just pick at that and see what unfriends.
I'm going to answer this question from a slightly different angle because they've done so brilliantly. I'll take it from the top instead. When you've got something that's established in a role-play game and you pass it over to everybody else, you tend to find that they will focus on details that as writers you might not have thought were that consequential. They might see a particular NPC that they adore. They might see a particular detail or artifact and they've changed it into something else. And that can often be memed in the most unexpected fashions. And looking at those, developing those, and using those in later supplements is, for me, one of the great joys of role-playing games. It's always amusing when you see other people taking something that you thought was one thing when you were creating it, and they come out with the stories of how it was used, and you're like, wow, I did not expect that character to act like that. Well, that's very interesting, but I like it. And using that and adapting it unfolding it into your later work is just a lot of fun.
I'm going to go from one we've got live from Creative Phosphate. So they have asked, some writers use flowcharts to plan ahead. How does that work for you? Or do you think that using flowcharts and tools like that will limit the creativity?
Well, it's interesting because down in the Creators Hall behind us, I think, they are selling writers' notebooks, which has room for flowcharts and diagrams of your plots and stuff. And you know what? If you want to use that, fair game to you.
Whatever works. I'm not a planner. Don't look at me.
No. Like I was saying in the previous question, I know I have a beginning. I kind of have an ending. Probably this is where I want it to go. The rest is discovery scene by scene. And then even more will be discovered in subsequent drafts when you've got an overview of the whole. But
do you write it chronologically?
Yes. I'm trying to think if I have ever. I'm trying to think if I've ever not done that. Yes.
No, write that group.
You say that.
Because I don't. I write all the scenes I like best first.
Yeah.
So if there's a really cool ending, I like the cool ending. I don't
Yeah.
Right,
I
yeah,
was
yeah,
actually thinking of like Red Dwarf, but they were literally doing it backwards.
You do get to like
Yeah.
best first, and you've got all the really fun and cool scenes, and you think, oh, they need some plot to hold them all together because they have to get everyone.
Yeah.
And then you draft a bit of plot and you write it in a document,
A
and
bit
then you
of
forget
plot.
about it. I'd done a plot line, I reread it, and I thought, oh, that's really interesting. I didn't do that. I should do that. And then I read something else where I'd said at the end, such and such a character ends in such fashion, and they'd ended on the opposite side. I was like, oh well, just let it breathe as well. Let it be what it wants to be.
We had a writer on Nathan Long and he uses post-its. So he has a similar thing. He has things that he wants to happen, key scenes that he wants to happen. Doesn't necessarily know when, and he's might forget them. So he used post-its and rearranges them until he can get this.
There's a lot of cutting and
coherent
paste
plot.
happening
Yeah.
in my plots. Yeah.
I'm a planner.
Mhm.
I'm the exact opposite. But that's because I'm writing to often a very specific set of key goals. For example, if I'm writing a book about places, all those places have to be, broadly speaking, about the same size. If I commission, for example, a book about a particular town in a fantasy realm, and it's going to have so many places, so many NPCs, so many bits, all of that will be, for them, planned, because it's, broadly speaking, super useful to have those plans in place. Sometimes in RPG writing, simply having 100 words in this, 100 words in that, 100 words in this, 100 words in that is handy. But there's a huge but in this one. Take that as you will. And that big but is that can stymie, and also it can sometimes really push creativity. Because if you've got a really clever idea and you want to try and figure out how to say that in a really clever way, in a short way, suddenly your writing can take on a whole host of tones it wouldn't normally take it. But sometimes it does restrict, and that's when discussions need to be had as to exactly how much space we've got in a particular book to do a particular thing. RPG books tend to be written to a particular size for print. They are not written and see where they go. They're pitched, they're discussed, they're pinned down in place, and exactly what the content will be is broadly normally planned. And whenever I'm speaking to a new writer, my first conversation is often, I strongly recommend a plan. Strongly, because you'll almost certainly come out with a stronger book at the end, and some writers don't. It's a choice. And I won't push it, but they don't, and sometimes books end up being in a very different place to where any of us expected, and sometimes that's a good thing. And sometimes you trust the writers, and there's many writers that I've brought on that I knew were going to say that, and I'm like, go. And they've come out with some beautiful work, and that's what it's all about. So yeah, it kind of takes slightly different angles.
It's interesting because the game writing I had to pitch, then write a summary, and then write it in chronological order.
Yeah.
And I hated it. The first time I hated it.
It's very much a different experience.
But of course, if you're writing branching narratives, you can't start with a scene in the middle because it's so complicated. It's all going to crash. Your code's not going. Already, you write one chapter and the code's terrible, and you have to redo everything. So if you were just writing bits in the middle, it wouldn't work.
Yeah.
And it can be good. It can be a good discipline, definitely, for writers, just to learn how to do it.
Ryan Dovark has a follow-up question. They really want structure. Are we responding? Jim Butcher uses scenes as the main unit of his storytelling. He even has a worksheet. Do you have any main organizational component or principle, if not a flowchart?
Come on, that one's for you, I think.
No. It's a flowchart comment. Heck no. Well, the most flow I have is scenes flowing into each other.
You have the standard
They throw
sentences,
it
paragraphs,
through, they
chapters.
channel through your fingertips.
Exactly. The challenge.
You are a word wizard.
Okay, I'm going to frustrate you even more by telling you that my new book doesn't have chapters. It doesn't use.
What is this heresy?
It doesn't use chapters. Every single every single part of the editorial process was like, "Are you sure?" I choked to death. Yeah, I got rid of chapters in the newest book because it made it. Thank you. Absolutely relentless.
Don't want to lose you.
Horrifically relentless in a great way. No, I think if I used charts, it would reduce the amount I can discover while writing. There's a big difference between you can plan and you can plan down to you have 100 word sections. You can give yourself limits. You can world build for days and months and weeks and years. But there is no accounting for what comes out on the page when you sit down and write. And I'm definitely more of the sitting down and writing and seeing what happens than the planning, and it still coming out on the page completely different.
Just to play the devil's advocate, I think for editing, it's really useful to think of it scene by scene.
Yes, absolutely.
Because I have sometimes written a book and then I've gone back and I thought, okay, this plot line, this through thread, this subplot, or even this character, I'm going to look at all the scenes they're in. And sometimes I take them out of the main novel document. I put them, copy and paste them all in a separate document, and I just comb through everything and make sure the character's consistent, the plot line's doing what I want, and then I put them back in. So scenes that are in the same place, for example, that can be really useful because you might realise you're repeating descriptions and things like that, or you're describing the same places within that setting. So maybe not in the first draft, but I think definitely in the rewriting, thinking of it by scenes can be really useful.
Yeah, I do that with adventures. It's in fact, it's an essential component, particularly for long-term campaigns, because when you're writing a story, it can go anywhere you want. But if you're writing an adventure, which has perhaps an end game that has to occur, you have to have not just a level of consistency all the way through, so that GMs can understand how to do it themselves, which is a really important component when you're writing your adventures. But you have to ensure that every single plot element makes sense and the person who's reading it understands it so they can present it. There's a great love of subtext in adventure writing, and it's super important, but you pretty much should tell your GMs that it's there, because they'll often miss it, and they'll often end up with a very different adventure, and when they find out what the subtext is, they'll often go, why didn't you tell me? The number of times I've had a book where I've gone, well, right at the very end, they explain everything. Great, this is 4 books in. And I needed to know that in the first book. Because this is a big campaign, so adventure writing is so very different, because you need to know the end for a big campaign before you set off. Because if you don't have it, the GMs will get lost. So it's quite a different process in terms of putting it onto the page. And if I wasn't doing that, I'd be doing this. Because it's how I prefer to write. It's where you end up. It's, my own personal campaigns at home when I'm role-playing are not planned in anything close to that sort of detail. They're far more free-form.
They couldn't be, because wildcard.
Wildcard, yeah, quite. Who knows what the PCs will do? And that's the way I like it. But when it comes to presenting a professional product that other people are going to be using, it requires quite a different set of tools.
But the editing sounds quite similar. So, often when I'm editing adventures or the work that teams have done, you are thinking about the sense of place. Could this actually happen in the location? Has something been introduced that shouldn't? Especially in adventure writing, where there's sometimes a map, sometimes there isn't. But it's the same kind of idea of extracting everything that happens in different places to make sure that it could all happen there with those people at those times. Any more questions?
Not double dip, but when obviously with science and fantasy, you're kind of writing things that are kind of inherently other. So how do you get yourself into a mindset to write alien worlds or alien people and cultures or strange cultures like that?
I did stressing easy. I'll let someone else answer.
This is a huge question. There's a lot of elements. First of all, there's the almost theatrical style of getting into character, of putting. In writing, it tends to be easiest by finding a voice for that character, knowing what they sound like, and from there you get their whole demeanor. You get the way they think about things because of the way they say it. And stuff like that. But there's also, it's an interesting question, because you're also talking about non-humans, and how do you get into the mindset of writing non-humans, which is extraordinarily difficult, because we as humans anthropomorphize everything. Literally everything, we anthropomorphize it, because we have to put it into our own terms to be able to understand it. So how do you write non-human things? There are some very few examples. You might have read Laura Jean Mackay's The Animals in That Country, which does an extraordinary job of de-anthropomorphizing non-humans. It's a book about what if COVID gave everyone the ability to understand what animals are saying. But it does it in such a way that it retains their non-humanness. They remain non-human. And it uses almost poetic elements to do that. So I strongly recommend, if you're interested in writing non-humans and non-human voices and not anthropomorphizing them, because anthropomorphizing non-humans does bad things to them. It puts us in charge of them in ways that we are not. But I recommend that book, The Animals in That Country.
That's actually a very similar basis to what we've been discussing and what I would do. And because my degree is in psychology, I've done a lot of work in like sociobiology and evolutionary psychology. So I like to think about like the biological basis for their behavior and almost if evolution exists in their world, how did they come to be like that? And you can do it, say you took the dwarves in a world, you could either just say, well, they're just like humans, but they're on a world with beards, and then on a world where gravity is higher. You know, their sex is similar, their gender is similar, like the balance is the same. Or you could go like down a different route and you could say they're quite like bees. So there's, you know, a single queen, the men are all workers, everyone comes from that one queen. And what would that mean? They live underground. So what would that mean in terms of what their senses would be like? And then that might lead you on to go, well, maybe they're actually quite like naked mole rats, so they don't mutate, they live forever, and you can come up with, just using the like biological variety on this planet, loads of different things that they could be biologically. And once you have what they could be biologically in place, that starts to drive the different behaviors. Like naked mole rats, when a snake comes down their burrow, they'll all get into like this kind of multi-headed hydra and attack the snake. Because genetically they're so related to each other, because they breed a little bit like bees, so they all come from a queen, that they have more of a level of altruism that, say, humans would be, who have a selfish gene, if you want to go back to the selfish gene, which is quite an old book now. But yeah, I like to think about it in terms of the biological basis for what their behavior would be. And once you start thinking how different that is in non-human species, you can start to think of different ways for them to be.
I think challenging your default is good.
Yeah.
What you create by default, look at it and think, what am I just putting in there because that's what I'm expecting? So xenogenesis, like Teddy Butler, is also really good for another species. And again, they're really funny, the uncanny, because they treat humans a bit like we treat animals. A bit like, look, we know what's best for you. Don't you get excited and kill each other all the time. Like we're going to be in charge now. And imagining what non-human entities would be like if they were in charge is really interesting. And for creating different cultures, aside from different species, you can just look at what varies across human cultures. You think, well, often death rites vary. Some people bury their dead, some people leave them by exposure, some people burn them. So, you know, think about death rites. Food often varies. Food is often a big bone of contention between cultures. So look at things that vary and think, okay, gender roles tend to vary. Clothes that correspond to certain genders. The number of genders, you could play with that. So you look at the things that you can play and vary with, vary that a bit, change your variables, see what happens on the page. If some stuff just becomes just too weird or doesn't fit your story, pare it back. But I think questioning some of those basic things that you take for granted will help creating something quite different.
In fantasy, we tend to run into the problem of the Shadow of Tolkien, which is all of the different races are just flavors of human. So we're still struggling our way out of it, honestly, but it is an improving thing, and especially in the fantastic, newer authors are looking at non-humans with fresh eyes, which is really lovely.
But it can be fine if you're sort of building on existing tropes and taking them somewhere new. As long as you sort of know where you're coming from and what the expectations are, then you can take it somewhere really unexpected. That can be an interesting sort of conversation to have with Tolkien as well, if you're thinking of answering what before.
We've had a lot of discussions about gender roles. So in a fantasy world, sometimes if it's kind of like dark medieval fantasy, the gender roles are portrayed as very similar to what we have here. Traditional gender roles in Western cultures. But actually those dark fantasy worlds usually have pantheons of male aspected gods, female aspected gods, a mix of gods, and unlike the Greek gods here, they actually do things. So you can actually demonstrate, you can be empowered beyond your physiology, you can be empowered beyond, the realities of your physicality. And so that, like, I would always encourage, if you're thinking about fantasy worlds, to think about what are the gods real, and if the gods are real, like, what impact would that have on a culture?
And even beliefs, because what you believe people can do, what you believe that their role is in society, even if your gods don't actually act in your world, still that really impacts how people, what people do.
It's even coming to terms with, are your gods just another flavor of human again, or are they more, unknowable?
Right. I'll take a slightly different view. I'll take the role-playing view. How do you get yourself into the head? I think these answers are beautiful because they tackle so many different aspects of what is required to not make them all just Star Trek people with an extra bomb. Okay, the Shadow of Tolkien, the Shadow of Star Trek, the Shadow of all of the legacy sci-fi and horror and fantasy tropes that we've had, where it's often people who have not really had a good think. And that's the first starting point. Have a good think. Actually, have a good think. I know, it's really obvious, but do it. And then I'm going to take a different angle entirely. Instead of worrying so much about how to make your alien fantasy race, whatever, what makes humans different? Start thinking about why they're different, and then you start thinking of humans outside the box, and then you can start putting yourself into a mindset that's separate from being a part of that group. Take a single example. Say, for example, you were a species that sat on the outside looking at humans. You could see them as a colony creature. All of their various organs are almost separate entities. Their biology in their stomach dictates their brain. Parts of them are completely different to them genetically. You could view them as a swarm creature, and they swarm wherever they go. It's just a single idea. The second you view humans as something different to how you normally map them, you can start looking at them from another outside perspective. And that can bring stereotypes that will come in from the outside. They'll start saying, well, humans are just like this, humans are just like that. And you start building a separate mindset. But underpinning all of that, you need to have a core idea of what that species is. It's something that is a massive bugbear of mine, because all too often, they are just humans with pointy ears or brow ridges or whatever. It doesn't hit it. I mean, it can be fun, and it can be often a lot of fun to subvert. And sometimes it's great to lean into these tropes because we enjoy them and we were brought up in them and they're super fun. And that's cool. But if you want to take a different angle, do so.
Any other questions?
I was wondering if you could name an adventure or a scenario, could be one you've written or one you've played, and the system that it was on, just where you really enjoyed the writing or the experience somehow. Just a really quick name check, maybe something people could look up so they can go, oh, I like the sound of that. Or even if it's a book as well, or just something where they can go, oh, that's kind of cool, and that would be cool to check out. I really enjoyed that.
I mean, I recently rediscovered, but I mean, a lot of people will know it, I discovered Paranoia, which had been in the background for so long, and I kind of knew it and I'd never played it. I think maybe there wasn't a good French translation available in the local shop, that was all it was. And it's very, very fun.
Computer is your friend.
The computer is your friend.
Was it the newest edition, or was it the newest edition, or was it the old edition?
Well, I found sort of PDF of everything.
Oh, okay,
oh
fair
good lord. And some new stuff used cards and some stuff didn't. So I just picked one edition, which I'm not sure if it's the latest or the one before.
It is, actually.
And then I just thought that and thought I'd play that. Because there was so much there that I thought, okay, I'll just have to pick one. Yeah.
It's a bit out of fashion these days, Lovecraftian sort of horror.
Oh, damn it. I'm going to figure something else.
The new weird is sort of dying a death, and Lovecraft is well and truly and deservedly outed as the colossal racist he was. That being said, I did search for years and years for an RPG that felt like cosmic horror, which is very, very difficult to do, because cosmic horror is a very special brand of horror, and most Call of Cthulhu stuff out there isn't that. It's very, it's noir, it's guns blazing.
It can become a bit pulpy somehow.
Yes.
Indeed, there's a pulp game for it, representing that. Yeah.
Exactly, which is why I really loved, it was one particular module for Trail of Cthulhu called The Dying of St. Margaret's, which makes you feel absolutely, it has the effect on the players of proper cosmic horror hopelessness in the face of an insurmountable, unknowable entity. Which it's the first time I've seen it done really, really well. I've run it twice, and both times it was just absolutely fascinating to run. Because it even encourages you to open with the idea that this isn't a game you're going to win. It captures that cosmic horror feeling really well in a way I haven't really seen before.
Am I allowed to jump in on this?
Go.
Shadows of Tolkien is a French role-playing game, but I know it's been translated into English. And that's really good because there's a psychological element that the more you go through, the more you live adventures, the more you get mentally damaged. And so ultimately your character is going to be unplayable. Either they become sort of harder and harder and less empathic because everything they've seen has kind of shut them down, or quite the contrary, they become sort of more and more tuned to the supernatural, but they're completely losing it. And it can be very fun to play because you know you're doomed as a character. But it's fun. Like, and you start losing your grasp of reality, and it starts getting worse and worse for you, but you're still really trying. I don't know, that's a good one as well.
We had Chris Framus on from Green O'Neill, didn't we? And they're just kick-started the Cthulhu Awakens game with their age system, so I would recommend that. Chris is a friend of the Recreate, really amazing guy, and has really thought long and hard about the problematic aspects of the creator.
Yeah, so I'd like to open with, God damn it, steal my idea. And then we'll go in a completely different direction because I was going to go down the dark and cosmic horror, but I'm instead going to go light and bright and crazy. One of my most enjoyable roles that I have ever had was working on Critical Role's maps. As jobs go, it was a pretty easy one. It was, here's my world, can we map it? That sounds simple, but that wasn't what the job was. The job was getting in contact with a whole bunch of really cool people. And working on the books with them, turning up for their lovely little launch parties. It was eye-opening in a way that I can't describe as a white, hetero guy in my 40s with a beard. They were not that. Everyone I had worked with for about the last 20 years had looked vaguely similar to myself. That wasn't the case when I went along to the Critical Role parties. Everybody was different. And it was reflected not just in themselves, but in the work. The books were just full of such beauty and creativity, which had been, I would suggest, restricted for a very long time, not purposefully, but by the people who were creating it, because everybody generally writes what they know, and even when they try to write beyond what they know, they still tend to sit in their safety zones, because you're often worried about going somewhere that you shouldn't, because you don't want to talk to someone else's experiences. And it was just beautiful. Thoroughly recommend their books. Thoroughly recommend them just as a crew in general. They were beautiful.
I have a friend who's doing a whole PhD studying the effect that Critical Role and these internet RPGs are having as an effect on the rules and the worlds that are being created, and the way that we're looking at the legacy of D&D past and re-examining it in the wake of a diverse new fanship and set of players. It's extraordinary. It's so exciting.
Yeah, sounds amazing.
I'm just going to give a shout out to the World Anvil lot who've just arrived, like off the board. Not in the room. Sorry. They're in the comments. Sorry, forget you can see the comments. Usually everyone can. So yeah, World Anvil. Hi, World Anvil. We're at a sci-fi festival in Edinburgh. They're asking.
Oh, that's where we are. Partly works.
So here's another one from Kilishandra, which is another writing question. So what's your schedule for writing? Do you sit down at a PC all day? Do you coffee shop? It's all very difficult. Do you plan and execute, just write and see something less structured? So like, what's your physical?
Do you have a writing routine? Have you got a nice structured answer for that?
It depends on the book. Every book I put together a new set of rituals. Just because I find having a small set of rituals before sitting down to write helps me maintain a certain state of mind a little bit better. It's very, very difficult to do. Every day is a fresh state of mind. The scenes will be new, and it will end up being a collage instead of a considered one thing beginning to end. it always ends up feeling more like a collage than anything else. But little routines help, I think, and different every book. Quick answer.
I'm afraid I don't really have a routine. But I think one of the reasons for that was that I often had a day job and I had to write around the day job. And if I wanted to write, I just had to do it when I could. So I wrote when I could, before, if I could get up before. I wish I could say I got up at 6 a.m., but I am not a 6 a.m. person. I woke up, 15 minutes before I needed to be out of the house. And then, wrote on the bus, wrote, on breaks, wrote. The first job I got when I was in the UK, I was a tour guide for the Man United football stadium. And so between guys, I know, right? They needed a French speaker to do the tours in French. So I do a tour of the football stadium, and I'd sit in the staff room. Everyone was having a brew, and I'd sort of sit with my little notebook and sort of write as much as I could down before the next tour. And that's how the first novel came out. I'm not surprised, it's got very short, very snappy chapters, which I suspect
Tremendous amount of respect for being able to write
Thanks.
that way. So that
Yes,
is,
it is. Yeah, that's not happening with me.
Andy writes by not sleeping.
I start and then I kind of don't stop, and I just sort of go, and then I can't, but I'm really lucky because I wear multiple hats. So one day I'm writing, next day I'll be editing, next day I might be doing some rules development, next day I might be doing something completely different, doing a big map or something, and that allows me to keep my focus. I sometimes can't do one job, but I can do the others. And I bounce from one to the next, the next. So I just have this constant run. And yes, sleep partly is an enemy.
Dark for Days Radio, who is a regular in the chat and has been on the stream a number of times, it says Pomodoro technique I find works well both for writing, for games, and for programming.
I have no idea what that is.
No.
20 minutes on, roughly. It's the Italian for tomato, and the guy had a little tomato timer. You do roughly 20 minutes, you go quite hard for 20 minutes, no distractions, have a little break, and then do it.
I couldn't do that. I mean, I love the idea, but once I start and I'm in, I'm going.
Yeah.
And I'm going, and it's suddenly 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'm still going.
I have a question, I'm afraid. I'm really interested in the relationship between writing rules as mechanics and narrative tools and the narrative specific elements. How do you approach that? I guess written for RPGs.
Completely, to be quick in that one, it requires a completely different set of English.
Yeah.
For example, zero comma is essential. It's a very small thing, but it ensures that certain rules can be very clearly defined. Without them, often rules get misunderstood. Right down to the very precise nature of every single grammatical point. Rules writing is so very different to just slapping out an adventure. I say slapping out, that sounds terrible. Okay, but by comparison, adventure writing is easy. Rules writing, if I wanted to write 5k worth of rules, in the same time I could write an easy 40k worth of adventure. It's far more technical, it's far more exact, and you have to ensure that it can be understood by the reader, and you have to be ensured that your intent is understood. Where when you're writing an adventure, it's all about their interpretation. All about their interpretation of what is cool for them. Where when it comes to rules, it's all about conveying that core message accurately, which means very precise English.
We've only got a couple of minutes.
Only more?
It's kind of a follow-on question from what you said there. You mentioned mapping a couple of times.
Yes.
Is there a process with the creative process of mapping that is in some way similar to writing as well? Because you're kind of creating a social geographical construct. Is there similarities for you? Or
Given we're very close to the end of time, I'll sum that up with yes and no.
We'll be here
Catch us in another stream.
I'm just going to finish with one final question, not for you, Andy. The viewers can get your views another time.
Yeah, sure.
But it's a chance for relentless self-publicising.
Oh, very important.
So, out of everything that you have had published so far, which are you most proud of and why?
You can't choose one of your
How can you say everything?
The others are going to get very upset.
Which of your children is your favourite?
We all have an answer.
I mean, no, we don't.
If you tend to just submit a bibliography, I'll put it on our Discord server.
What I'm going to do is turn to the camera, My new book, Glitterati, is out now, as of a couple of weeks ago. Look it up online. It's about fabulous people being horrible to each other.
Right, you've got a pitch and everything. Wow. Yeah, The Collarbone just came out. I'm still very much writing the trilogy, so I'm very much into that. There's some books in Blackwell's downstairs, and I'm happy to sign them if you want them. Yeah, and The Game Weavers was the first book that I got published, so obviously it has a special place in my heart for that. Yeah, and otherwise there's short stories and sagas and stuff. I love them all, of course, except when I'm editing them and then I hate them all. That's how it works.
Oh, yeah, you love them well.
Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us today. Viewers, where's the camera? Oh my gosh, I feel like I'm famous. I don't usually have a camera. It's usually my laptop. Thank you for joining us today from the Cymera Festival. Thanks to our patrons, as always, to our guests, to our Discord server community, to the organisers of the festival, and of course, last but not least, to all of our viewers and the lovely audience that came to see us today. As always, like and share on YouTube, and join us next week when we are
Joined by Peter Lattimore. We're going to be discussing something that popped up actually in this episode, streaming your games online and what's involved with that. One of the reasons we're covering that is because I'm also intending on doing that like an idiot. Yeah, I'm going to be giving that a go relatively soon. We're in the process of converting the cards for that. Why? Who knows? But yes, we're doing that. So he's coming along. He runs Garblag Games that run all manner of different games and stream online, and is well worth watching just to see what he has to say about that.
So until then, see you next week.